Tasha Williams woke up early on a crisp Thursday morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. It was a normal day, one that felt like all the others. She brushed her teeth, made a quick breakfast, and kissed her 2 children goodbye as they rushed out the door for school. As she did every morning, she took a deep breath, centered herself, and mentally prepared for the busy day ahead. A teacher at the local elementary school, Tasha was used to long hours filled with lesson planning, marking papers, and managing a classroom of energetic kids. But even with her demanding schedule, she always found a moment to make her family feel loved and supported. Her husband, Captain Michael Williams, was already out of the house, heading to his shift in a neighboring city. Michael worked as a respected police captain, a man known for his integrity and dedication to his job. Their relationship had always been strong, built on years of mutual respect and love. Tasha admired Michael's unwavering commitment to the community, but she also knew the toll his job took on him. Long hours, high-pressure decisions, and the constant threat of danger hung over him like a cloud. Still, they made it work, always finding time for each other whenever possible. As Tasha finished her morning routine, she grabbed her keys and headed out to run some errands. The small-town grocery store was her next stop, a place she frequented regularly, where everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was a familiar setting, a peaceful escape from the demands of her busy life. She had a list in hand: milk, eggs, bread, and a few other staples. The store was quiet when she walked in, just a few other shoppers moving about, filling their carts with the same items. Tasha smiled at the cashier as she walked past, exchanging pleasantries with an elderly man in the dairy aisle. Nothing about that morning felt unusual. As Tasha made her way through the aisles, reaching for the last carton of eggs on the shelf, a figure caught her eye. It was Officer Jake Carter, one of the local cops. He was tall, with sharp features and a swagger that most people found charming. Jake had been working in the town for a few years now, and like many of the officers in the area, he was well known. He greeted Tasha with a smile, and they exchanged a few casual words about the weather. Jake had always been friendly, even a bit flirtatious, but she had never thought much of it. He was just another officer in the small town, someone who was always around but never crossed the line. Tasha tried to ignore the slight unease building in her chest, chalking it up to a busy day and her mind wandering. Jake's presence didn't seem strange at first, but as they exchanged more words, she began to feel the shift in his tone. His comments, once innocuous, now felt more deliberate. He lingered just a little too long, standing too close as if trying to catch her eye. Tasha, already tired from the hustle of the morning, smiled politely and excused herself, stepping to the side to grab some vegetables. But Jake followed her, and his casual conversation began to feel more like an interrogation. He asked about her husband, Michael, his tone shifting, now more pointed than before. She felt uncomfortable but chose not to react. There was no need to make a scene. Tasha grabbed what she needed and turned to leave the aisle, hoping the moment would end. But Jake didn't let it. He stepped forward as she moved past, his hand brushing against her side in what seemed like an innocent move. But it wasn't innocent. His fingers lingered, just enough for Tasha to feel the unmistakable pressure of his touch. She froze, a jolt of shock coursing through her veins. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. She felt the weight of his hand on her body, the violation that happened so quickly she almost couldn't believe it. Was it an accident? Or had it been intentional? Tasha pulled away, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself, her heart pounding. "Sorry about that," Jake said, his voice almost too smooth, as though he hadn't just crossed a line. His words were casual, but his eyes told a different story. They were scanning her, gauging her reaction. Tasha wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded and quickly walked away, her legs shaky beneath her as she tried to process what had just happened. Her mind raced as she pushed her cart toward the checkout. She kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on the task at hand. The weight of the situation began to sink in. She felt disgusted and violated, but the last thing she wanted was to make a scene. She wanted to forget about it, to pretend like nothing had happened. But the image of Jake's face, his hand on her body, haunted her. As she checked out, her thoughts drifted to Michael. She knew he'd be upset if she told him, but he deserved to know. And yet, a part of her hesitated. The situation was complicated. Michael's position as a police captain in the nearby city meant he held significant influence in the community. How would he handle this? Would it tarnish his reputation? Would it affect his career? What if people didn't believe her? Tasha didn't have answers to these questions, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this go. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She wasn't just some woman in a grocery store. She wasn't going to let Jake's actions define her. And as much as she feared what might come next, she made a promise to herself that she would take a stand. She left the store, her mind still racing, but with a new sense of determination building inside her. When she got to the car, she immediately reached for her phone. She dialed Michael's number, trying to steady her shaking hands. As the phone rang, she glanced in the rearview mirror, gathering her thoughts, knowing that what she was about to tell him would change everything. As Tasha's phone rang, the seconds felt like hours. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her, the pounding of her heart so loud in her ears that she almost couldn't hear Michael's familiar voice on the other end. "Hey babe, how's your day going?" he asked, his voice warm and comforting. Tasha tried to steady herself, but her throat felt tight, her words caught between the fear of what she was about to say and the weight of what had just happened. I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. She paused, gathering her thoughts. How could she possibly explain this to Michael, the man she trusted with her life, the man who worked so hard to protect their community? How could she share something so personal, so violating, with him, knowing it might destroy his sense of safety in the world they lived in? The words she had rehearsed in her mind moments ago now seemed too hard to say. She felt vulnerable and exposed, but she had to speak. "It's about a cop, Jake Carter," she finally blurted out. There was a long pause on the other end. Michael's voice turned more serious. "What about him?" he asked, his tone shifting. Tasha took a deep breath, steeling herself. He groped me today, Michael. In the grocery store. I didn't know what to do." The words came out in a rush, almost as though she was afraid if she didn't say them quickly, she might lose the courage to speak at all. The silence on the other end felt deafening. Michael didn't speak at first, and Tasha could feel her pulse racing in the quiet, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She waited for him to respond, but when he finally did, it wasn't the anger she had expected. It was quiet, controlled, as though he was trying to process the information she had just given him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I can't believe that man did that to you." Tasha could hear the frustration in his voice now, the deep anger that she knew mirrored her own. But even though she felt comforted by his concern, a small part of her still hesitated. "Michael, I don't know what to do. I don't want this to mess up everything. You're the captain. What if this causes problems for you? What if people think I'm just making it up or causing trouble?" She let out a shaky breath. "I don't want to bring this kind of heat down on you, on us. I don't know how to handle it." "Don't worry about me, Tasha," Michael replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You are my priority. What matters right now is that you're safe, and that this never happens again. Don't even think about protecting me. We'll figure this out together. I'm going to handle it, I promise." Tasha felt a sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by dread. The weight of what she was asking of Michael was enormous. She had seen the sacrifices he made for his job every day, how he put the safety of others before his own and how he carried the weight of his position with such dignity. But now, the very thing he had worked so hard to protect, the trust of the community, his career, was at risk, all because of the actions of one man. She couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to be turned upside down, and there was no going back. She tried to gather herself, pushing the tears threatening to fall to the back of her mind. "I don't want to make this harder on you," she said quietly, feeling the vulnerability of the moment. "I don't want to cause any more trouble than there already is. But she broke off, the words choking her. "I don't know what to do." Michael was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "Tasha, listen to me. You are strong, and what happened to you was not your fault. You are not going to carry this alone, okay? We will take action. I will take action. I don't care who he is or what he thinks. Jake Carter will be held accountable for what he did. You don't have to carry this burden. I'll take care of it. And if anyone tries to question your character or your integrity, we'll face them together." Tasha nodded even though he couldn't see her. His words gave her a moment of peace, but she still couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. The next steps were unclear, and the unknown loomed over her like a dark cloud. She hadn't asked for any of this. She didn't want to be thrust into the center of a storm, especially not one that involved the very system her husband worked so hard to uphold. But she also couldn't let Jake Carter's actions go unpunished. After a long pause, Michael spoke again, this time with resolve. "I'm going to take care of this. You don't need to worry about anything else. Just stay calm, and we'll handle it the right way." Tasha felt a sense of solidarity in his words, but the reality of what was about to unfold was starting to hit her. This wasn't just about one man's inappropriate behavior, it was about the larger system in which it had happened. Michael's job, their community, everything they had worked for, could potentially unravel because of this. She was suddenly very aware of how fragile everything could be. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "I trust you." After hanging up, Tasha sat in the car for a moment, collecting her thoughts. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, and her mind raced. The day had started so innocently, and now everything had changed. She was caught between two worlds, the one she had always known, where she lived a quiet life with her family, and the one that was now pushing its way into her life, a world of power, secrets, and accountability. She didn't want to be a part of the system that her husband worked within, yet here she was, forced to confront it head-on. How could she take a stand against the very thing that had wronged her without threatening everything they had built? How could she navigate a situation that seemed designed to tear everything apart? Tasha started the car and drove home, her mind swirling with possibilities. She knew there would be consequences, immediate ones, and ones that would unfold in the weeks and months to come. But she also knew that there was no turning back now. She had made the decision to speak out, to make sure Jake's actions didn't go unchecked, no matter what the cost. And as the car rolled through the streets, she found herself bracing for whatever would come next. When Tasha arrived home, she immediately locked the door behind her, feeling a deep sense of isolation. The house, usually a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a battleground. Her hands trembled as she set her keys down on the kitchen counter and began to pace the room. She could still feel Jake's touch on her, an invisible mark that seemed to stain everything she touched. Her stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to focus. She had made the call to Michael. She had made the decision to stand up for herself. But now the reality of what she had set in motion was sinking in. The consequences were unclear, and she couldn't shake the gnawing sense of fear that accompanied it. She tried to calm herself, but the images of what had happened in the grocery store played over and over in her mind. She kept replaying Jake's smile, the way he had stood just a little too close, the way his touch had lingered with an arrogance that made her skin crawl. Tasha had always trusted her instincts, and right now, every part of her screamed that something was wrong, that Jake was not the man he pretended to be. But what could she do? Would anyone believe her? What if Michael couldn't make things right? Tasha had lived her whole life in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. The thought of questioning one of their own, especially a cop, made her feel exposed. She sat down at the kitchen table, her mind racing, and let the silence wash over her for a moment. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from outside. It was in that quiet, almost peaceful moment that she realized something crucial. This wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about what it meant for everyone around her. This was going to affect Michael, their family, and the community they had built their lives in. She could feel the weight of it, pressing down on her chest, but she refused to let it break her. It was just after noon when Michael returned home. His footsteps in the driveway were louder than usual, his boots striking the concrete with an urgency that sent a ripple of tension through Tasha. She stood up quickly, her heart racing as she walked to the door. When she opened it, she found him standing there, his face tight with resolve, his uniform still neatly pressed, but there was something different in his posture. He wasn't just her husband in that moment, he was the captain of the police force, a man who had been called to action. There was a palpable shift in the air as he stepped inside. "I've already made a few calls," Michael said without preamble, his voice low and steady. "I've talked to the chief. We'll start the formal investigation tomorrow, but I need you to be prepared for the fallout. This is going to get messy, Tasha." She nodded, her throat tight. The reality of his words settled over her, a heavy cloud. She wasn't ready for what was coming next. But she had made the decision to stand up for herself, and now there was no turning back. She had to trust Michael, trust that he would do everything he could to protect her, even if it meant dismantling a part of the system he had spent his entire career building. But was that possible? Could they really bring Jake Carter to justice without everything around them falling apart? "I know it's going to be hard," Michael continued, running a hand through his hair. "But we can't let this go. You deserve to be heard, Tasha. And if anyone tries to discredit you or push this under the rug, we'll fight together." His words gave her some comfort, but the dread that had taken root in her chest still lingered. Tasha knew that, for Michael, this wasn't just about standing up for her, it was about the integrity of the department, about making sure that no one got away with violating their position of trust. She could see how conflicted he was, how torn between his duty to his wife and his duty to his job. The days that followed felt like an endless blur of meetings, phone calls, and tense conversations. Tasha barely had time to process everything that was happening. Her life, once defined by quiet routines, had been turned upside down. Michael was doing his best to keep her grounded, but even he couldn't escape the pressure that was mounting on all sides. The moment they had made the decision to move forward with the investigation, it felt like the eyes of the entire town had turned on them. There was a sense of inevitability to it now, a feeling that, no matter how hard they tried to control the narrative, things were spiraling out of their hands. Michael was the captain of the police force, a respected figure in the community, but even his authority couldn't guarantee a smooth path ahead. The chief had been supportive at first, offering reassurances and expressing confidence that Jake would be held accountable. But as the days went by, Tasha began to sense a shift. The once open channels of communication between Michael and the department started to feel more strained. Jake's colleagues, many of them longtime friends and allies, began to distance themselves, casting nervous glances in their direction when they passed in the hallways. It wasn't blatant. It didn't need to be. There was a subtle change in the way people looked at them, in the way the air seemed to hum with judgment. It was clear that there was a faction within the department that was willing to protect one of their own, no matter the cost. Tasha noticed it most when she went to the store, or when she ran into people she had known for years. The whispers were louder, the glances more pointed. People who had once greeted her with a smile now avoided eye contact, walking hurriedly past her as if afraid to engage. She had always known that the town could be close-knit, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about gossip, it was about power, loyalty, and fear. People weren't just avoiding her, they were actively choosing sides. And it wasn't just about Jake's actions anymore. It was about a larger question: who would the community stand with when the system they had always trusted was suddenly exposed as flawed? Tasha tried to remain strong, but the weight of it all began to wear her down. The constant second-guessing, the anxiety that gnawed at her every time someone avoided her gaze, the tension in her own home as Michael navigated a minefield of politics within the department, it was all too much. She began to feel as though the walls were closing in on her, as though she was being suffocated by forces beyond her control. Even Michael, for all his strength and determination, seemed different. His once confident demeanor was now tinged with a quiet unease, a worry that he kept hidden behind the facade of professionalism. One evening, after another long day of meetings and tense phone calls, Michael returned home later than usual. Tasha had already put the kids to bed and was sitting at the kitchen table, her mind racing. When he walked in, his face was drawn, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Without saying a word, he went straight to the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and took a long sip. Tasha could see the storm brewing inside him. He had always been the rock, the one who had the answers, who knew how to handle the chaos. But now, she saw the cracks in his armor. She waited for him to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he walked to the living room and sat down on the couch, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Tasha joined him, sitting beside him quietly. She wanted to ask what had happened, to demand answers, but she could see the toll this was taking on him. So, she simply placed a hand on his, her fingers brushing against his rough skin. For a moment, there was silence between them, just the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, the low hum of the house settling for the night. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low and filled with frustration. "This isn't what I thought it would be, Tasha. I thought the system would work. I thought, with the evidence we had, that we'd get justice for you, quickly, decisively. But now I don't know." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, raw emotion. "I'm starting to wonder if anyone will care. If anyone will stand with us when the time comes." Tasha felt a pang in her chest. She had known that this would be hard on Michael, but she hadn't realized just how much he was internalizing. She wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that they could weather the storm together, but she didn't have those words. Instead, she squeezed his hand, silently offering her support. "We'll get through this, Michael," she said quietly. "You've always done what's right. Don't stop now." He nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his eyes. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep pushing. If Jake goes down for this, it's going to rock the whole department. I'm not sure the rest of the force is ready to face that kind of scrutiny. And if they protect him, if they turn on us," his voice trailed off, and Tasha could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. She sat back, the full scope of the situation washing over her once again. She had been so focused on the immediate violation, the injustice of Jake's actions, that she hadn't fully realized the far-reaching consequences of what they were doing. It wasn't just about one man's misdeeds, it was about a system that had failed to protect her, and a department that could either stand up for what was right or crumble under the pressure of its own corruption. Jake had crossed a line, but now the real question was whether they would have the strength to hold the line, even when it felt as though everything was about to come crashing down. The next day, the investigation took a dark turn. Michael received a call that made his blood run cold. One of Jake's closest allies within the department, Detective Carl Jennings, had been speaking with the mayor's office about the growing tension surrounding the case. The mayor, who had always prided himself on maintaining a close relationship with the police force, was beginning to show signs of wavering support. The investigation was becoming too hot, and there were whispers that it might be best to quietly sweep the whole thing under the rug before it caused irreparable damage. When Michael shared this with Tasha, she could see the frustration boiling in his eyes. The thought that the system could protect Jake, despite the evidence, felt like a betrayal of everything they had worked for. But Michael, ever the professional, knew that they couldn't back down now. He would fight this, even if it meant risking everything. But the truth was, he didn't know if it would be enough. "We can't let him get away with it," Michael said quietly, his voice determined despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface. "We can't let them sweep this under the rug, Tasha. Not this time." Tasha nodded, feeling the weight of his words in her bones. She had known from the beginning that this would be a fight unlike any they had ever faced. But now, as the stakes grew higher and higher, she realized just how much was at risk. And she couldn't help but wonder, was she ready to stand with Michael through this? Was she ready to face down a system that could easily crush them both? It was no longer just about what had happened in the grocery store, it was about their future, and the future of their entire community. As the investigation dragged on, Tasha could feel the tension in her bones. Every day felt like an uphill battle, each conversation fraught with uncertainty, each glance from a familiar face laced with judgment. The community, once a comforting and predictable place, now seemed like a foreign land, unpredictable and cold. News of the investigation had spread quickly, and soon the whispers turned into open conversations, fueling a storm that neither she nor Michael could escape. People were choosing sides, but not in the way they expected. There were those who rallied behind her, offering quiet support, but they were far outnumbered by those who quietly defended Jake. They clung to the belief that someone in his position couldn't possibly be capable of such a crime. The longer the case lingered, the more divided the town became. The weight of it all was wearing on Michael. He had always been a rock, a man whose confidence and resolve had made him a respected leader. But now, every day felt like a battle, one that seemed to have no end. His conversations with the department had become increasingly tense, with some officers questioning his ability to lead the force effectively under such scrutiny. A few of his closest allies had distanced themselves, unwilling to stake their reputations on an investigation that could cost them their careers. The mayor, too, was wavering, pressured by his own connections to the department and the growing backlash from certain members of the town. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about power, control, and what was at stake for everyone involved. Michael and Tasha spent hours talking late into the night, trying to make sense of what was happening. Michael's frustration was palpable, and Tasha could see the toll it was taking on him. He was a man who had spent his life building trust in the community, yet now it seemed like that trust was crumbling. He hated the idea of compromising his principles, of bending to the demands of those who were more concerned with maintaining their power than with finding justice. But the further the investigation went, the more Michael realized that they were in a battle not just against Jake, but against the system itself. The realization gnawed at him. How far would they be willing to go to protect one of their own? One night, after a particularly heated conversation with the chief of police, Michael came home visibly shaken. Tasha could tell something was off even before he spoke. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the sound of his boots on the floorboards. He entered, looking exhausted, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up, Tasha," he said, his voice strained. "It's not just Jake anymore. It's the entire department. They're all watching me. Every move I make, every decision, it's like they're waiting for me to fail." Tasha set the knife down and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through tough times before, Michael. This is just one more fight. And you're not alone in it." Michael shook his head, looking out the window with a deep sigh. "It's not that simple. There are people who have already made up their minds. They don't care about the truth, they care about protecting their own. If I push too hard, if I go too far with this investigation, I'll lose everything. My career. My reputation. All of it." Tasha could see the strain in his eyes. She knew he was a man of integrity, someone who would never back down from doing what was right. But the pressure was breaking him, and she hated seeing it. She understood his fear. She knew what this case could do to them, to their family. But she also knew that they couldn't let Jake win. They couldn't let him hide behind the badge and the system that was meant to protect the community, not exploit it. Tasha stood firm, placing both hands on his arms. You can't let them control you, Michael. You have to keep going. You have to do it for yourself, for me, and for everyone who believes in you. The weight of her words lingered in the air. For a moment, there was silence between them, just the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Michael's jaw clenched as he considered her words. She could see the internal struggle, the part of him that wanted to protect their family and the part of him that couldn't stand the idea of compromising his values. But in that moment, Tasha knew what he needed to hear. She knew that the only way forward was to keep fighting, no matter how difficult it became. I'll fight, Michael finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. I can't back down. I won't. Over the next few weeks, Michael and Tasha threw themselves into the investigation, determined to uncover the truth. They found themselves facing roadblocks at every turn. The department, while outwardly supportive, was slow to act, and the evidence they had collected seemed to disappear or be dismissed at the first sign of resistance. Jake, meanwhile, walked through his days as if nothing had happened, confident that the power of his position would protect him. But what he didn't know was that Michael was working quietly behind the scenes, building a case against him that could no longer be ignored. One morning, Michael received a phone call that would change everything. A former officer, who had recently been fired from the department for unrelated misconduct, had come forward with new information. He claimed that he had witnessed Jake's inappropriate behavior in the past, but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, with everything on the line, he was ready to tell the truth. This was the break they had been waiting for. The moment that could tip the scales in their favor. With this new information, Michael and Tasha were able to push the investigation forward, despite the increasing resistance from within the department. It wasn't long before Jake was called in for questioning, and the weight of the evidence began to mount against him. What had once seemed like an impossible battle was now turning in their favor. But even as the walls closed in on Jake, the storm was far from over. The town's response was still divided, and many were waiting to see how the situation would unfold before choosing their side. The final test of Michael and Tasha's resolve was yet to come. As the day of Jake's hearing approached, the town was on edge. The pressure was unbearable for both Michael and Tasha. They knew that this moment could change everything, not just for them, but for the entire community. The question now was whether they could maintain their integrity and fight for justice, no matter what the cost. The fight was far from over, and they knew that their journey was only just beginning. But with the truth now on their side, they were prepared for whatever came next. This was their moment. This was the chance to right the wrongs and bring about the change they so desperately needed. And they weren't about to let it slip away. The hearing was set for the following Friday, a day that would either confirm or destroy everything Michael and Tasha had worked for. The town, once a peaceful and close-knit community, was now a powder keg, waiting for a spark to ignite it. The streets buzzed with tension, and every conversation seemed to revolve around the case, whether in hushed tones at the grocery store or loud debates in local diners. People had chosen their sides, some in support of Michael and Tasha, and others still defending Jake, determined to protect one of their own. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. The entire police department, the community's trust, and Michael's career hung in the balance. That Friday morning, Tasha woke up with a heavy heart. She had barely slept, the weight of the upcoming day pressing down on her. The events of the past weeks had left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no time to rest. Today was the day they would face Jake, and it was clear that whatever happened next would change the course of their lives forever. She watched Michael as he got ready for work, the usual confident, composed man she knew now seemed like a shadow of himself. His face was drawn, his eyes tired from sleepless nights and endless stress. She could tell that he was holding it all together by sheer force of will, but she also knew the toll it was taking on him. He had always prided himself on doing what was right, but the personal cost of this investigation was starting to break him down. "Are you ready?" Tasha asked, trying to sound reassuring as she handed him a cup of coffee. Michael paused, his hand hovering over the mug, before finally looking at her. "I don't know if you can ever really be ready for something like this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But we don't have a choice. We have to face it, Tasha. All of it. Whatever happens, we have to see this through." Tasha nodded, her heart swelling with pride. This was the man she had married, the man who stood up for what was right, even when it meant going up against a corrupt system. She knew that this would test him in ways he never expected, but she also knew that this was the man she had always admired. The one who wouldn't back down, no matter how hard things got. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. It was clear that the case had captivated everyone in the town, and everyone had their own opinion about what had happened. There were whispers and hushed voices as people speculated about what would unfold, but Michael and Tasha kept their focus. They had worked tirelessly with their lawyer to prepare for this day, gathering all the evidence they could, piecing together the puzzle of Jake's past actions, and calling in witnesses who were willing to speak out, even at great personal risk. It wasn't just about proving that Jake had crossed the line, it was about showing the world that abuse of power, no matter where it came from, could not be tolerated. As they sat in the front row, Michael's hand gripped Tasha's. She could feel the tension radiating off him, but there was something else in his eyes, something different. There was determination there, a resolve that came from knowing they were on the right side of history. No matter what happened, they had done everything they could. And in that moment, Tasha realized that this fight was about more than just one person's actions. It was about creating a ripple effect that could reach beyond the department, beyond their town, and into the hearts of everyone who had ever been silenced by fear or intimidation. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began, and soon Jake was called to the stand. He sat there, trying to maintain his composure, but there was an air of arrogance to him, as if he believed his position and connections would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He denied everything, of course. His version of events was filled with contradictions, his story constantly shifting as the defense tried to paint Tasha as someone who was simply making false accusations out of spite. But it didn't take long for the truth to emerge, piece by piece, with each witness that was called and each document that was presented. The former officer who had come forward, the one who had witnessed Jake's past behavior, told his story, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. With each testimony, Jake's once unshakable confidence began to erode. The cracks in his story became more apparent, the lies more evident. Tasha sat there, watching it all unfold, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. She had never wanted to be in this position, never wanted her life to be turned upside down by someone else's actions. But now, as the truth came to light, she felt a sense of justice that she had never experienced before. When Michael was called to testify, the room grew still. Tasha knew that this was the moment of reckoning, not just for Jake, but for everyone who had stood by him, who had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. Michael stood tall, his voice calm but filled with conviction as he recounted everything that had happened, the evidence they had gathered, and the steps they had taken to ensure that the truth would be heard. He didn't shy away from the hard questions, didn't hesitate when asked about his personal connection to the case. He spoke as a man who was doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. There was no denying what Jake had done, no escaping the truth of his actions. The judge's decision was swift and final. Jake was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, and the community was left to pick up the pieces. For Tasha and Michael, the battle was over. But the scars it had left on them, on their family, and on the town would remain for a long time. As they left the courthouse that day, Michael looked at Tasha with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," he said quietly, as though still processing everything that had happened. "We really did it." Tasha smiled, though she could see the toll the fight had taken on him. "We did it together," she replied. And as they walked hand in hand into the uncertain future, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it as a team, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The community would heal in time, but the lessons learned from this experience would echo long after the case was closed. And maybe, just maybe, their fight would inspire others to stand up and speak out when they saw injustice, no matter where it came from. In the days that followed, the community slowly began to rebuild. It would take time, but people started to have conversations that they hadn't been willing to have before. The department underwent significant changes, with new leadership brought in to restore trust and accountability. For Michael and Tasha, life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. But they both knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Their courage, their willingness to stand up for what was right, had changed them, and, in a way, it had changed the entire town. They had fought for justice, and in the end, they had not only prevailed but had made their community a better, safer place for everyone. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but Michael and Tasha knew one thing for sure: they had done the right thing, and nothing would ever take that away from them.